Hey, Michelle, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Ready to dive into this oh so interesting topic here.
Yeah, continuation a little bit of last week, but welcome back,
Mhm.
everybody, to Business Chicks Podcast, where we get real about leadership, resilience, and the wild ride of being a woman in business. I'm Michelle.
And I am Kim. And together we have over 60, almost 60 or over 60, I don't know, somewhere around 60
Yes.
years of experience in business, leadership, marketing, and sales. And we are going to talk tonight about a conversation that I am oh so excited about. And it is a topic that I think every ambitious woman has at times grappled with, especially these days, because there's a lot of talk about protecting our peace, right? And so
Mhm.
giving up versus giving in,
Mhm.
are they the same thing? Are they different?
Yeah, and it's one of those questions, right, that hits deep, especially for women who are already, we're used to pushing through and proving themselves. So let's
Mhm.
break it down together.
All right. So when we talk about giving up and giving in, what comes to mind for you? How do you immediately think about the difference?
So for me, giving in is about flexibility.
Mhm.
So it's knowing when to pivot, compromise, adjust, adjust your approach for a bigger picture. It's not necessarily about quitting. It's about choosing your battles and being strategic. And you and I have had that conversation.
Mhm. Yeah, and for me, and this is where I've really kind of struggled with this a little bit today, is preparing for tonight, because
Mhm.
my natural tendency is to equate them pretty much as the same thing. Like for me,
Mhm.
historically, if I feel like I'm giving in, then I feel like I'm giving up something. It's kind of like the whole idea of compromise, right? The whole idea of a
Mhm.
compromise is everyone is supposed to leave feeling better, but essentially everybody, both sides in a compromise have to give up something. And so that's what I kind of struggled with about today when I was thinking about giving up versus giving in. And I was originally I went through this period where I originally was going to go, for me, it is the same. Like it is the same, and I don't want to do it.
Mhm.
And yes, I am stubborn, and sometimes that has worked against me, right, in my career. Sometimes, and I guess the word that keeps popping into my mind is capitulate. Is
Mhm.
giving in is capitulating, and it may be that because of that association in my head, I'm thinking of it, or I was thinking of it. I've kind of wrapped my mind around it in a different way as the day has gone on, but I was originally thinking of it as capitulate. Like I had to, if I was going to give in, that meant I was giving up something that I wanted. But that's part of the problem, right? Is that we
Mhm.
women a lot of times have been trained, or not trained, but programmed or
Mhm. Yeah.
whatever, taught to feel that way, that by giving in, we were giving up. And so sometimes I'll just speak for myself here, dig in my heels sometimes just because I don't want to lose, just because I don't want to capitulate, just because I don't want to give in. Have you ever felt that way? Like you're literally sometimes I forget what I'm fighting for. I just don't want
Sure.
to lose, right?
Okay, so yes, and I think this is exactly kind of the whole big picture to this to me about why it's so difficult to
Mhm.
kind of separate a little bit because the giving in, we've been told for many years to be the bigger person,
Right.
right? Be the bigger person. Well, sometimes being the bigger person means that you have to let things go and
Mhm.
giving in
Mhm.
sort of thing, right? So I just recently went through this, which is what's funny that we say this. And I will
Mhm.
say that this was not with a female in our company. This was actually with a male in our company that I just recently went through where there was an issue they were having with someone else in the company. And they were like, well, I'm just not going to deal with them. Like, I'll just, I'm just not going to deal with them. Unfortunately, that's not reality when you work with someone, especially in a smaller company like ours. Um,
Mhm.
so the whole conversation we had was, in from my opinion to them, was you have a decision to make
Mhm.
because you are going to work with this person for a long time.
Mhm.
So what is better? Is it better to continue to dig in your heels, be stubborn, and continue to carry your pride forward? Because I'm not saying you're wrong. Does it matter in this capacity,
Mm-hmm.
whether you're right or wrong? For the bigger good, for your team, for your company, for your department, for your whoever's involved.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I think the giving in, and it's honestly kind of what we do with our kids sometimes, right? You pick your battles.
Right.
And that's the reality of it. You pick your battles, and you have to do the same thing at work. So sometimes it's not about giving up. It's about giving in for the greater good of your sanity, your
Mm-hmm.
peace of mind, and to work in an environment where everybody can kind of get along. It doesn't mean you should do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's, I think, kind of where I came around to today as I was thinking about this, because I started thinking about, I'm like, such a good topic, because I can literally think back in times in my career when, like I said, sometimes it has hurt me and sometimes it has helped me. And I would think in general, or thinking back, I would say in general that I feel like it's not necessarily whether it was giving up or giving in, but it was sometimes my inability to see the difference between the two that maybe was most harmful to me when I think about times that were harmful. So I really sat with that for a bit today, and like, what is the difference between giving up and giving in? And what I came down to, and I'm going to share something here in just a second that was interesting, because it was from an English as a second language group in Facebook of all things that was discussing this. They were talking about the difference in expressions, and I'll share that in just a second. But it was what really made it clear for me is, giving in sometimes is protective versus giving up is more defensive, as ironic as that sounds, because you would think it would be the opposite, right? Giving up would be protective and giving in would be defensive, but really it's the opposite. It's like we give up to that is a defensive stance, right? It is a win-lose, it is a net sum gain. And versus giving in is more to protect the peace or to protect relationships, like what you're talking about, what you were talking about in your example, to protect the peace and the future possibilities by not burning bridges. So I'm going to share this little article because it was so cool. It was in, like I said, in a Facebook group, and I was really kind of surprised that it spoke so clearly to me on like how to define this. Because like I said, I was struggling. So this English speaking practice, author, I can't tell if that's male or female, but I don't think it really matters, says, I was thinking about how give up and give in might sound similar, but they aren't quite the same. As English learners, it's easy to mix them up because they both involve stopping. And I thought that was interesting, right? They both involve stopping. And so I thought that was really cool. But it goes on to say, what I realized is that the context changes their meaning significantly. So give in means to surrender. And I was like, see there, that's why I don't like it. But the author goes on, right? Give in means to surrender. Think of it. Then this starts where it gets a little bit different. Think of it as allowing yourself to accept something or letting someone else have their way. And I was like, you know what? That's why it bothers me. And it shouldn't. And that's one of the things I'm constantly having to work on myself. And maybe some of our listeners out there or viewers out there, that's one of the things I'm constantly having to work on as part of my leadership growth, is realizing that letting someone else have their way doesn't mean that I lose, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why we have that stigma around giving in. But the author goes on to say, for example, I finally gave in to my friend's request to join them for tea. In this context, gave in shows a decision, and there's where it changed it for me, right? Giving in shows a decision to accept or comply, but it doesn't mean quitting. And I was like, wow, that is going to make it so much easier for me to give in when I realized the power behind that, right? When I learned that or heard that from this piece, and I was like, wow, that puts you in a position of power. You are choosing, you are making a decision to accept or comply versus quit. So it's like, okay, wow. Give up, on the other hand, means to quit or stop trying. that's why it's defensive. That's powerless, because
Mhm.
when we become powerless over our situation, we give up, right?
Mhm. Yes.
Because we are assuming power, because we are taking power over our situation, we are giving in. And I
Mhm.
think for me, that's when I really like had this epiphany and went, okay, now this is making sense to me. Why
Mhm.
we would give in, because that allows us to keep our power. We are making a decision
Mhm.
versus giving up, which we are relinquishing our power. And that's why it's defensive. So I was like, okay, wow. And then it says, here, gave up implies you decided to stop trying altogether. Both phrases
Mhm.
might seem close, but give in is about allowing or accepting. So again, that's that power, letting us retain our
Right.
power, while
Right.
giving up is about abandoning something entirely, which is the relinquishing of power. And then I love this. One technique I used to think about my intention. Am I accepting? And I would say, I would add, based on the way I understood it from what they were saying, is this a decision I am making,
Mhm.
or am I powerless? And if it's a decision I am making, then I'm giving in. If I am powerless and feel like I have no power and it just is what it is, then I am giving up. So I love that.
Mhm.
I really, really like that. What do you think about that? I thought that
Yeah, I do like that. And I think for me, I mean, that's very similar, I think, to my thoughts on
Mhm,
this is how they were before, right? And coming with a little bit of a military background in
mhm.
it, to me, is the giving in is to adapt. You're
Yes.
adapting, you're improvising, you're overcoming.
Mhm.
Giving up is to retreat.
Yep.
So that's how those two play in my head. I'm just, again, it's based on what you've
Right.
been through, what you've done,
Frame of reference,
what do
Lynn.
you know, what can we prove?
Right.
And that's the whole thing is, the giving in to me, and I think that's really where it's so hard to tell the difference in the moment.
Mhm.
Right. Am I giving in or am I giving up? Well, I
Mhm.
feel, to me, and this is just my personal side of it, when I give up, I feel it.
Right.
When I give in and I'm adapting, I think it.
And there's really no other choice if you give up.
Right.
If you give up, you kind of like are at the end. You're at the end of
Mhm.
the chances, the
Mhm.
choices, the
Mhm.
opportunity, and and it's like the choice is taken from you. This, it just is
Yes,
what it is. And yes, you're in some ways you're making a choice, but really you don't have a choice, right?
correct.
And
And
so
you don't feel like you do.
right.
Mhm. Mhm.
Versus giving in is, like you said, choosing to fight your battle, which
Mhm.
battles to fight, I would say.
Mhm.
And then also making that conscious decision that, I'm either going to save this for another day, right?
Right.
Another time, another event. Um,
Mhm.
I need, or it could even be strategic where you are strategically giving in to, hey, I'm going to call this chip in later, right? I mean,
Right, exactly. Or there's a bigger picture, or I've just learned something I didn't know before,
mhm,
and now I see it. Or I had to take a step back and someone else helped me have a conversation, and now I see the situation differently than I did before.
right.
So, that's where you're adapting to a situation.
Yeah, I just
Mhm.
thought it's funny, and I didn't think I would get so much out of an English,
Right. No,
learning
it's an
English speaking.
interesting area for that.
Yeah, to find that, but I guess it just
Mhm.
really spoke to me about, since I am one that tends to be power dominant, and
Mhm.
it's just my natural tendency, and there's probably a lot of leaders out there that are like that and that have to fight that the same way I do, and I'm just a power dominant person. Oh, sorry, my son's coming home from work, so the dogs are deciding to greet him. But hey, no. I am a power dominant person, meaning I like not the feeling of power over somebody else. I like what power does for me. It motivates me, it inspires me. And I don't mean, again, power over somebody else. I mean power over my destiny, right?
Yeah, but
Power
is that power or is that control?
yeah, it could be either way,
Right? Because I feel like in that situation, to me, power gives that a very negative connotation on
Mhm.
what you're saying,
Yeah,
who you are. And I don't feel that that is a power thing for you. My
control over
side
my
of
destiny.
it, right?
Yeah.
It's having control, and not in a controlling manner, but having control. Those are two totally different
Right,
things.
right,
To
exactly.
me, so I don't see it necessarily as a power
That's a
situation.
good point. I think that's a good point. And thank you for helping me reframe that, because sometimes that bothers me, right?
Mhm.
But I do think you're right. It's not control. Like, I don't want to control others. I want
Correct.
control over my destiny. In
Mhm.
other words, I want control over my success and my failure. I
Mhm.
don't want to feel like I am at the mercy of circumstances, other people, situations. And so that's when I say control, that's kind of what I mean. I want to
Mhm.
be able to navigate, to
Mhm.
guide my own success and failure. If I'm going to
Mhm.
fail, I want to know it's because I failed. I didn't do good enough. I didn't come up with enough, alternatives, whatever. And so for me, that whole giving in and giving up has been so tied up in my identity that I really am so glad we did this segment, because realizing how much, power, control, freedom is in giving in was a
Mhm.
really powerful moment for me. It helped me to realize that by giving in, that does not mean I'm giving up. Can be
Right.
a strategic choice. And so, I think it's in leadership, right? We always talk about don't quit, never quit, never.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's important, I think, to have this conversation, because, some people, and when I teach the Navy, I teach these different styles, right? There's different
Mhm.
styles, and the circumplex, and I teach based on human synergistics. And generally speaking, it breaks people down in all their behaviors in management and leadership into 3 different styles, which are aggressive, defensive, passive, defensive, and constructive. And generally speaking, you don't want to live in aggressive, defensive, or passive defensive. You want to live in constructive. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is perfectionism
Mhm.
and dominance and dependence and avoidance and all these things. And at the heart of all of them is the idea of diligence, of not giving up, and resilience. And, it was interesting as I started going through the show notes and really thinking about myself. And I know you've got a course on resilience that we're going to
Mhm.
be coming out with here soon, is how closely that concept is tied to giving up and
Mhm.
giving in cut. Because if we give in, right, then we are exhibiting resilience, because we are saying giving
Correct.
in does not mean the end, right? It means
Mhm.
I am making this decision, this choice
Mhm.
for now, for whatever reason,
Mhm.
but I am demonstrating resilience because I know it's not the end. But
Mhm.
really, giving up, it eliminates resilience, because by
Mhm.
giving up, you're saying there is no hope, right?
Right. Right. You're just giving it. Yeah. And the best leaders I know are the ones who can adapt. So sometimes giving in, like a shift, a project's direction, or letting go of an old plan, it's actually the
Mhm,
smartest move. So I would question a little bit for you, just in what we were just saying,
mhm,
is that when you think about that, you don't want to give in because of you like or you are in control of your destiny. You want to be in control of this, that, or the other. But
mhm.
those things also, Kim, are adapting,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
you are adapting to those different situations. But when we say it as adapting,
Mhm.
it sounds different than giving in. But they're
That's
really the
a great
same
point.
thing.
Yeah, that is a great point. If we put it through that lens, giving
Hmm.
in as that adapting, or, negotiating, right?
Right.
Or
Hmm.
compromising, or,
Hmm.
any of those things, it's a lot
Hmm.
easier to stomach for me, because
Hmm.
I did come up in that time where you don't,
Hmm.
you don't give it up. You definitely don't
Hmm.
give up, right? But
Hmm.
the equation, the, you know, equaling, or whatever, I don't know what the word I'm trying to say is, but of the equating giving
Hmm.
up, giving in, a lot of my leaders did equate those two things, because they
Hmm.
were, military background in some cases,
Hmm.
right? Or just, largely alpha males, and
Mhm,
that's fine, I mean, but
mhm,
that they equated that, right? They
mhm,
equated
mhm,
giving up with giving in. So that's kind of what they,
mhm.
preached to me. And
Right, right.
it's really, kind of like eye-opening for me as we've had this conversation today. Now, in practice, I think I do it much more than my natural tendency felt like earlier today as I was
Sure.
thinking through this while eating my lunch,
Mhm,
is my natural tendency is to say, oh, I don't want to give up, I don't want to give in. But I think I do it in practice a lot more than my jerk reaction is, because in practice, I start looking at it as strategic and as necessary and just compassionate in some cases, right? And I feel like I have very strong compassion. So in some cases, it may not be what I want to do, but I may do it to let somebody else win, or to not rock the boat, or to not make waves, because sometimes peace is more important than winning for me.
Agreed.
And so I think there's that distinction too for our audience. If you're out there thinking, yeah, they're the same thing and I'm not, is there is that distinction between what we feel as a natural tendency and then what we do in practice, because we are human with emotions and empathy and just we sometimes just don't want the drama, right? And so we're just, it's not worth it, right? Don't sweat the small stuff. So I think, for all of us that are leaders, another lesson there is just because we feel a certain way naturally doesn't mean we have to act that way, or that's not what we have to do in our leadership. And I think there's a bigger lesson in there. I mean, probably a whole other show. There's a bigger lesson in there about life, is a lot of times people feel like we have to be controlled by our emotions, right? If I feel this way, then I must do this. And I think that's unfortunately where, and again, bigger story. So I'll just make it really brief. I think unfortunately that's where a lot of the world today, society today, has issues, is because we are ruled very often by our emotions. And we think if we feel something, we must act on it. If we feel, mad, we must express our anger. If we feel, and yes, bottling things up isn't great, but it just goes to feelings are choices. And just because we feel something, it doesn't mean we have to act upon it. And that can be the same for giving up and giving in. Just because our natural instinct, maybe, I don't want to ever give up, I don't want to ever give in, doesn't mean that's the way we have to act. We need to strategically think about, and that's what kind of all of our lessons are about, strategically think about our career, our goals, what we want, what we need, where we're going, and what is going to serve that better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's really, we kind of get into that space with something like this, where we're back to that. You have to look at the big picture.
Right.
And I mean, there are definitely situations where, I have, given up. And when we talk about, is it time to go?
Yeah.
Last week when we were talking about, is it time to leave? There are definitely times where I gave up because I knew there was no giving in that would present a
win-win,
a good outcome for anyone involved. And when we talk about giving up and giving in, keep in mind that when we're talking about these things, we're not talking about things that you feel morally about.
Right.
It's not a compromise for something that is affecting something that you believe the company's doing that's not morally right. Or someone being treated a certain way and you're not standing up for them. That is not at all. Those are not the situations we're discussing.
Right.
Because that's a whole different, literally a whole different show.
Yeah, that's an ethical conundrum. That's not
exactly.
Yeah, that's not just practical application.
Exactly. And so that sort of thing, you have to do what's right in that scenario. But for these, I think we get lost in the verbiage. And we've talked about this in other shows, how much we get lost in the verbiage of giving up and giving in, because we were taught, I mean, I left a company because I gave up, and I needed to. It turned out to be the best decision, but I felt really bad about making that decision at the time. I mean, again, single mom, taking care of kids, but I was miserable every day and, that sort of thing. So I did give up. And I did give in, and that sort of, I gave in first and it didn't work. And then I gave up because it wasn't working.
Well, oh, go ahead.
It's okay. I'm saying it's just, those are really tough decisions sometimes because you get mixed up in the minutia of the verbiage.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to say, is that I think at times I've done almost the opposite, where because of my nature And because, and especially in my younger years, I would say professional immaturity, right? I had given up at times when I should have given in, where because of my seeing it, not understanding the distinction between the two. And I think that's one of the hopefully lessons that, our audience might get out of this, really short discussion of a really big topic.
Yes.
Is because of my professional, I think, career immaturity and maybe age immaturity too. There have been times when, because I did not see this distinction between giving in and giving up, I gave up when I probably should have given in, and really nurtured that decision a little bit more because I saw things as so cut and dry. And I think that's one of the risks with professional immaturity and not having been around the block, is if you have that tendency to see them as one and the same, sometimes you think your only choice is to give up.
Right.
And then you cut off your nose to spite your face. And I think, it's unfortunate, but there's also a lot of emotion tied around words, I think, for women more than men.
So okay. I agree with that. Why do you think we, especially as women, sometimes see flexibility as weakness?
Because I think we feel like it's expected from us. And as a result, as we are trying to get our professional footing and leverage, we rebel a little instinctively against that old premise that women should always be the ones that are flexible, right? We should always be the ones that are looking out for somebody else's feelings, that in a compromise in the past, and if you're joining us new, we do not hate men. We're just talking about the difference in men and women, in their careers and in this position, in the space we're in now. And I think historically, that was what women were expected to do. In any discussion, you were expected to acquiesce to the man. You're expected to be flexible. Oh, you can be flexible. You can, like we've talked about before, when it comes to like taking care of your kids and your family responsibility. Oh, you can be flexible. And I think that's one of the reasons why we might get so, emotionally charged about that word and about that idea, is it somehow puts us back in that position where we feel unequal. And I think that is, what it does to me, that whole, desire to appear tough enough to sit at the men's table. Right. And especially in those male dominated spaces, I feel like sometimes we equate flexibility with empathy, the ability to see the other person's side. And like, we're supposed to do that naturally because we're women and we're caregivers and we're supposed to, and there's a little bit of resentment. You probably hear it in my voice, but in me about that, right? Is even though I consider myself very compassionate, very empathetic, I don't want someone else to tell me that that is what I should be. I want to be that because I am that, not because somebody else is telling me that's what I should be doing. And really the reason why they're telling me in most of those cases is because they don't want to. And that's where it becomes a battle of wills. And that's kind of how it is for me, at least.
So that's a good point. So I have probably one of my favorite books. It's called Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek. And so part of one of the things that really comes across from him is that sometimes strength in leaders means letting go.
Yes.
And, sometimes the resilience isn't about never bending. It's about knowing when to, and then when to stand tall. And that to me, I think is why this resonates to me differently than it does you, because of the way it's the terminology. You really, if you think about everything we're talking about right now, it's so true that it's really based on the terminology that people use and that we've been accustomed to.
Yep. That is so true. And, like I was saying, like you said, a lot of it boils down to that concept of resilience as well, right? Is, resilience, the ability to bounce back and, say I've been here before, I beat it then, I'll beat it now. Or, the ability to just, no matter what happens, to keep getting back up And I think giving up is kind of the antithesis of that, right? Of
Right.
resilience. Although, yes, at some point there are people that give up and that still eventually display resilience, but in its very core, giving up is the antithesis of resilience versus giving in leaves that door open to resilience, because ultimately resilience isn't about never bending, right? It's about knowing, like you said, where to flex and where to stand firm. And I think that is so critical that we understand, because like I mentioned, there have been times in my career, and one of the things, you and I have always hoped to do with this is to help other younger women that are earlier in their career. I think there have been many times in my career, I would say maybe many in 30 years, there have been many times when I have given up, and there comes a lot of resentment comes with giving up, right? Which makes it harder to be resilient. And it starts to build this baggage, just like in relationships, right? A lot of times we equate leadership to parenting and relationships. It starts to build this baggage that you then carry with you to your next position, to your next role, or to the next, opportunity. Like once you have, and people have probably experienced this, right? Once you have had an interaction or two with someone in your company, in your professional contacts, whatever, where you have felt like you have given up when maybe you shouldn't have given in, right? And you feel kind of beat down, like you have lost. I would say after once or twice, any future exchange with that person, you're taking that baggage into it, right? You're taking that baggage with you. And if instead of giving up, there had been taking that power back, right? More of a giving in, that puts you in a position where I think you can go back to the table each time with resilience, because you don't feel like you're losing at every interaction, at every exchange.
Yeah, knowing when to say enough is enough. That is a strength, because empathy and adaptability are superpowers. The part of the problem, again, it comes back to the verbiage, right? Empathy has sometimes a negative connotation to it, because people think if you have empathy, then you're weak. That's not what it means. Same thing with this. Giving in does not make you weak. Saying enough is enough, that's a strength, So those are the sort of things we need to reshape, in my opinion, because they weren't that way when we were coming up in life and business and any of those. That's not how that was.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can probably see I'm sharing here another thing that I came across is in LinkedIn. I thought this was so great in light of what we were discussing. So before we go into our takeaways section, I want to just bring out a few points of this. And it asks, actually, I have trouble saying that word for some reason. It actually asks some interesting questions. So what this article is saying is the author is from the neuroscience transformation, is a neuroscience transformation and high performance specialist. That is a mouthful. And for emotional mastery for women leaders and teams. So I thought that was really interesting. But I like the way, this is phrased as well. It says, few motivational speeches will tell you that it is okay to give up. In fact, they will instruct you to do more, achieve more. This is where we talked about just a second ago, especially, the way I kind of came up feeling, right? Giving up or giving in brings to mind failure. So we pursue more, but at what cost? This is another really, I think, important point when we're talking about our mental health, when we're talking about our happiness, and and just our ability to, I believe work-life balance is a misnomer. So I would say have harmony between our life and our work. So what if giving up the things that do not serve us, whether physical objects, habits, or relationships, allows us to give more to ourselves, be a better friend, parent, coworker, or partner? We live in an uncompromising culture where the image of success is the person who does it all, says yes, and leads a busy life. Busyness is as much a status symbol as houses and cars. In media and conversation, we subconsciously learn that busy is cool. Running on coffee, adrenaline, no sleep, or achievement epitomizes the main character in any TV drama. Thought that was really interesting. And then she goes into what giving up is. The more driven we are, the harder it is to know when to quit a relationship, a job, a goal. As soon as we start school, we learn quitting is not okay. So we construct stories in our head to keep us committed. I thought that was really interesting too, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So in a relationship, he loves me. He just doesn't know how to show it. Or a job,
Mhm.
it'll get better if I stick with it, right? We talked about
Mhm.
that, natural
Yeah.
tendency to want to keep, like, I want to win this. I want to make it
Mhm.
for me, right?
Mhm.
And then goals. I've wanted this my whole life. I can't give up. And the problem with each of those is that they prevent us from genuinely reevaluating. Everyone, no matter how happy or how miserable, has the right to step back every so often and assess their lives, their job, whatever, right? This is not
Mhm.
being wishy-washy or ungrateful or overly critical. It's the first step to being aware that the life you're choosing to build. And so I like these exercises that, she gives is make a list of your values, like at how you
Mhm.
spend your time each day or each week. What are the top 4 you use that time for? Look at where you spend your money. Where's it going? Can you give it up? Compare lists 2 and 3. Do they add up? Why don't they
Mhm.
match? I just thought that was really, really interesting because what she gets at here is, now imagine you didn't have a choice. Imagine that donating to charity, for example, was as obligatory as paying your taxes, or that volunteering is important as going to work, or that taking yoga was as essential as doing the laundry. How would you make it work? What would you give
Mhm.
up? Now,
Mhm.
when you put give up in that framework, I was like, okay, really? That is what we're talking about. And she'll say here in just
Mhm.
a second, giving in to a different priority, a different answer,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And I like that when she gets into even further that you find yourself at the dinner table having a debate that's not any fun. It's the ego's stubborn nature to want to prove its point, no matter the cost. Giving in. I think you and I both know a couple of people that are like this, that want to,
Mhm.
win. And I think sometimes they even forget what they're fighting about or what they're arguing
Yes.
about. They just want to
Mhm.
win, right?
Mhm.
And giving in does not mean that you have to let go of your beliefs or adopt those of others. It just means proving your point does not define your worth. It's knowing when to
Mhm.
pick your battles. It's knowing, not to sweat the small stuff. And it's
Mhm.
knowing when it just doesn't matter, when it's easier to protect the peace, either for the now or for the future or whatever, than it is to fight the
Mhm.
fight. So I thought that was really interesting. But then I also, she kind of goes full circle and gets, not we have giving up, then we have giving in, now we have just giving. And I love that. It's like, what if we just focus on giving, and then
Mhm.
all of a sudden we find that when we give in, it doesn't hurt as much. That is the point she is kind of making, is that when we spend our time, if we're doing things that are not fulfilling and we're
Mhm.
not giving to ourselves, giving to others, that's when we start getting resentful and we don't want to give in. And we, sometimes find ourselves giving up instead of giving in. But her point is that if we focus on giving, then giving in or giving up almost becomes irrelevant. So I thought
Mhm.
that was really cool. And so she says, here, the main point of all of this is to remind you that you're the architect of your own life. And I love that. If
Mhm.
you're unhappy with how it looks, you can deconstruct and rebuild it at any time. So
Mhm.
I just thought that was an interesting little kind of, segue into our final section about practical application. Is we're saying ultimately it's all about taking your power back from
Mhm.
a good perspective, right? Taking back
Mhm.
your personal power and realizing that as long as you can still giving in, it loses some of its, I guess its threat, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And giving in is often a less drastic means of expression than
Yes.
giving up.
Right. Absolutely. And, you have to ask yourself, am I protecting my values or is it just ego?
Right.
And again, to your point in what you were just reading, we're back to that architect thing, right?
Mhm.
You're
Mhm.
the architect of your life, your
Mhm.
career, your whatever. We've had this conversation before.
Yeah, didn't we say
Sometimes,
that's what we were gonna, like, sit there
yes,
and talk
we're
about,
gonna
like,
we're
architecting
yep,
your career? Yeah.
exactly. So that's going to be our next course. Is going to be the
Yeah.
architect,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes giving is actually an act of self leadership, letting go, setting boundaries to protect your well being. It's one of those things where sometimes you have to understand that being a leader doesn't mean always being right. It
Yeah.
means being safe for people to tell you things, but it also is, letting go is sometimes the bravest thing that you can do as a leader,
That's
and
good.
that's the biggest part.
Yep. That is a great point. One of the other things that I teach, and I hadn't thought about it until in this framework, until you were just saying that, is imagine good leaders, right, are kind of like the train track architect, where
Mhm.
you always have these little extra spots, right, where you all
Mhm.
you got to do if something goes wrong on the track, you just disconnect and you just change the track quickly, easily.
Mhm.
You always have that ready, right? You're able to just make that shift almost seamlessly. And that's one of the hallmarks of a strong leader, is the ability to contingency plan and to pivot when necessary. And so I think for some of us, if we reframe giving in, sometimes, as you were
Mhm.
saying, it can be a matter of vocabulary. If we
Mhm.
reframe giving in as pivoting, I think it has a much more positive connotation if we need to
Mhm.
do that. We need, and some of us do need to play those little word games with ourselves, because we have
Yeah.
certain relationships around certain words. Like for
Mhm.
me, it's going to be a little hard for me to stop equating giving in and giving up. But I love the concept of, thinking it's a choice to
Mhm.
negotiate, or it's a choice to pivot, or it's a
Mhm.
choice to pick my battles. I think a lot of times you're right. It's in the nomenclature. And I think,
Mhm.
if we are using that word pivot, for some of
Mhm.
us, that's easier. But in the bigger
Mhm.
picture, that just goes to tell us how much of what we do and what we think is ingrained. And it is making those conscious decisions and stop and asking ourselves, is this really how I feel? And
Mhm.
is this really, is it worth the fight? Is it worth it? Or do I just want to win? And I just,
Mhm.
asking ourselves that question is architecting our career, instead of
Correct.
letting it happen to us. Because if you're consistently controlled by your emotions, you are letting
Mhm.
it happen to you.
Absolutely. And I mean, part of, back to the Leaders Eat Last. And if anyone has not read this book, you can get on audiobook, anything like that. But I highly recommend it. It made a huge difference for me. And I honestly go back and read it every now and then, because I don't think you can ever soak in everything. But I mean, the one of the things he says in there too is that, leaders are willing to sacrifice for their people. So
Mhm.
sometimes you have to sacrifice that ego.
For
You
sure.
have to do that. The true price of leadership is willingness to place the needs of others above your own. And I think that's what you do when you're adapting, when you're improvising,
Yeah.
those sort of things, is you're thinking about others, not just your team necessarily, but you're thinking about the company, you're thinking about the customer, you're thinking about, I mean, that can be for family as well. But, you have to put all of those in there. And the thing about it is, in my opinion, when you and I were coming through life and through business and things like that, we didn't have that option.
Mm-mm.
We didn't have the option to sit back and say, okay, I can compromise on this, because
Right.
then it was almost as if we were being walked over. And
Mm-hmm.
that would be the natural way that they would handle us,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, hopefully, we can teach others to not have that same um, trigger, in my
Yeah.
opinion, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a trigger, because of the way, when you're in a male dominant industry, like you and I have been all our lives, it's very easy for them to just brush it aside. And that's the way it was. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not making any sort of
Right.
anything. It's just the reality of it. And that's where the resilience came in. And you and I both had to be very resilient to get to where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And the hope here is that others will learn to use the right terminology, to
Mm-hmm.
use their voices, to understand, and at the same time, understand what's important and be able to make those decisions, pros and cons, like they were saying about the list. But the most important thing to me is for women to understand their value,
Mm-hmm. And that your
personally,
value
professionally.
isn't tied up with beating somebody else, right?
Correct. Correct.
It's not your value isn't how often you win
Mhm.
over someone else, or it isn't
Mhm.
how. I think that's one of the dangers that I've seen in a lot of younger women today,
Mhm.
is they perceive that if someone else wins, they lose. They see it
Right.
as that net sum gain, right? Where there's always a winner and always a loser. And they're
Mhm.
bound and determined to never be on the losing side.
Mhm.
They don't understand that they might be cutting off their nose to spite their face,
Right.
right? It can limit your career possibilities because you don't know who's talking to the boss and saying they can't play nice in the sandbox, right?
Right.
They always have to win. And mature leaders know a lot about servant leadership, and that servant
Mhm.
leadership is the type of leadership that is most likely to propel a company forward. And
Right.
servant leadership is not leadership. You know, it's one thing to want the company to always win and to be competitive, but when it becomes your everything
Yes.
to win every argument, win every scenario, you're going to find your career choices limited and hindered because somebody you stepped on is going to hold you back, is going to have the ability to hold you back.
Absolutely. And you could do it to yourself. I mean, at some point that self implodes,
Mm-hmm.
because you can only do that for so long. My thing as a leader, and I've been this way since probably my first managerial position, is that I always want to surround myself with people who are smarter than me in areas that I'm not.
Yeah.
Because that's what makes a good team and that's what makes us able. But even in that situation, however, you can't do that if you're always the right one or the smartest one in the
Right.
room, whether you really are or you just think you are. That's where it creates the problem. And that's where these giving up and giving in becomes an issue, a very fine line, in my opinion, too, because of the fact that sometimes when you're with people like that,
Mm-hmm.
who have that tendency to make sure that they let everybody know that they're the smartest ones in the room, or they know more about this or they know more about that. At some point you have to determine that giving in and giving up in this scenario doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. You're absolutely 100% correct. And it's unfortunate. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the dynamic, right? That's one of the dynamics of people and
Yes.
working with people that are often not as versed in some of these areas as they should be, that move into leadership positions because they were good at their job and so they got promoted, and they were good at that job so they got promoted, but all along the way they didn't really have any leadership training or any,
Right.
you're dealing with these people that in theory, we can say all these things and do all these things, right? But then you have
Mm-hmm.
the other side. Then you have
Right.
the other person. So
Mm-hmm.
that's, definitely a challenge because ultimately we can be right or
Mm-hmm.
we can be right all the time,
Mm-hmm.
or we can be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, I feel I'm like debating in my head whether I want to go out on a limb and say that, but I think I will. I think I am going to go out on a limb and say that you can either be right all the time or you can be successful. I don't think you can be both because ultimately
Mm-hmm.
you're going to need other people. And if you always have to be right, you're going to burn bridges that you will need in the future. And that is going to hold you back from moving forward. So your inability to give in ever
Mm-hmm.
is going to hold you back from moving forward in the future, I think.
Absolutely. And I mean, it can even hold you back in the present if you're dealing with a company where you have people that can help with your success or not. And
True.
a good example of that is both of our teams, actually.
Mm-hmm.
If people work with the inside sales teams, the marketing teams, things like that in companies, both those teams can propel someone in a company
Mm-hmm.
with customers and with their sales, or they cannot.
Right.
And it's all about how you deal with those
Mm-hmm.
people in those departments. So, and that there are multiple departments like that. I'm only using that as an example
Right.
because it's you and I.
Right.
But and I tell people this when they come on, honestly, my team can make or break you.
Mm-hmm.
If you work with them like you're equals, and which they are, but not everybody does that. I
Right.
mean, not where we are, but in the grand scheme of things, in big companies and in other companies I've been in, a lot of people don't understand that one other department can really make your life easy, or
Mhm.
they can make it very difficult. And you choose how that works a lot of
Correct.
the times.
Mhm. And that's whether, that's it kind of goes out to that human synergistics thing, whether you're
Mhm.
using constructive styles or passive defensive or aggressive
Mhm.
defensive. Aggressive defensive and passive defensive styles can get you somewhere,
Mhm.
not everywhere. And constructive styles can get you everywhere. And so, it's definitely one of those things where giving in can actually help you reclaim power maybe that you might have lost by giving up.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
I think that's a good kind of note for us to end
Mhm.
on, to kind
Yeah.
of wrap up here on.
Yeah. And here's a challenge for our listeners. What's one thing you could give in on today that would actually move you forward?
I
I
got to
think,
think about that one.
yeah, me too, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because if there is something, then that is definitely an analysis, a
Mhm.
self-analysis that is good to take at any time, is to ask
Mhm.
yourself that question regularly.
Mhm.
Is am I stuck because of my own inability to give in?
Mhm.
And what is it preventing and keeping me from? What success is it keeping me from by not being able to move forward because I won't give in?
Mhm.
It's a big thought,
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, thank you everybody for joining us here tonight on the Business Chicks podcast. And if this episode resonated with you, we would love for you to like and share it with a friend. And don't forget to ask yourself these questions, right? Is ask yourself these questions and really put this stuff to work and see how it can help you. And please follow us for more real talk on women's leadership and resilience.
Absolutely. Remember, giving in isn't the same as giving up. It's about choosing your path and intention and courage. Until next time, you can catch us on YouTube or on Spotify now.
Yeah.
So,
Michelle set us up on Spotify, so we
that's
are
right.
there as well.
Absolutely. Keep leading with empathy and strength.
Amen. Good night, everybody. Have a good night.
Night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.